The morning sun filtered through the large windows of McDonald's on Maple Street, casting long shadows across the red and yellow tiled floor. Robert Williams sat in the corner booth furthest from the entrance, his weathered hands wrapped around a small paper cup of coffee that had grown cold over an hour ago. The coffee was black, not because he preferred it that way, but because cream and sugar cost extra cents that he simply did not have. His army jacket hung loose on his thin frame, the fabric worn soft from years of wear and weather. The name tape had long since faded, but the outline of where it once proudly displayed his surname was still visible if you looked closely. On his left chest, a small American flag patch remained stubbornly attached, its colors dulled but still recognizable. This jacket was more than clothing to Robert. It was a reminder of who he used to be, of a time when he had purpose and respect, and a place in the world. The 62-year-old veteran studied the coins scattered on the table before him, with the careful attention of someone for whom every penny mattered. 3 quarters, 2 dimes, a nickel, and 7 pennies. 97 cents total. He had counted them 4 times already, hoping somehow the amount would magically increase, but mathematics remained stubbornly unchanged. The coffee had cost him 89 cents, leaving him with exactly 8 cents to his name until he could figure out his next move. Robert's face told the story of a hard life. Deep lines etched around his eyes spoke of sleepless nights and countless worries. His cheeks were hollow, the result of too many skipped meals and the constant stress of not knowing where his next food would come from. His gray hair was clean but needed cutting, and his beard was neatly trimmed despite his circumstances. Even in his current situation, Robert maintained his military bearing and personal hygiene as best he could. It was a matter of pride and discipline that no amount of hardship could completely erase. The restaurant buzzed with the typical morning activity. Commuters grabbed quick breakfast before heading to offices. Parents ordered happy meals for impatient children. Elderly couples shared newspapers over coffee and hash browns. Everyone seemed to have somewhere to go, someone waiting for them, a purpose that carried them forward through their day. Robert watched them all with quiet observation, not out of envy but with a kind of distant curiosity about the lives that continued to move forward while his own seemed frozen in place. 8 months ago, Robert had been like them. He had his own small apartment on the other side of town, nothing fancy but clean and warm in his. He received his disability payments from the Veterans Administration each month, money that covered his basic needs if he was careful with his spending. He shopped at the discount grocery store, cooked simple meals on his hot plate, and felt grateful for the independence he had managed to maintain despite his physical and emotional challenges. The apartment had been his sanctuary. After the chaos and noise of Vietnam, after years of struggling to readjust to civilian life, after the divorce that took away his family and the job losses that chipped away at his confidence, that little apartment represented stability. The walls were bare except for a single photograph of his unit from Vietnam. Young faces smiling at the camera with the invincibility that only 19-year-olds possess. Most of those faces belonged to men who never made it home, and Robert carried their memory with him every day. But stability proved to be more fragile than he had imagined. The rent increases came gradually at first, $10 here, $20 there. The landlord explained about rising property taxes and maintenance costs, and Robert understood the business side of housing. He cut his expenses where he could, eating less, walking instead of taking the bus, buying his clothes at thrift stores. For a while he managed to keep up with the payments. Then came the larger increases, $50 one month, $75 the next. The neighborhood was changing, the landlord explained. Young professionals were moving in, willing to pay premium prices for renovated units. Robert's small disability check, which had seemed adequate when he first moved in, suddenly fell short of what was needed to keep his home. He tried to negotiate, offering to do maintenance work in exchange for reduced rent, but the landlord had other plans for the building. The eviction notice came on a Tuesday morning in October. 30 days to find new housing or face legal action. Robert spent those 30 days walking through his small city, checking every apartment listing he could afford, but the same economic forces that had pushed him out of his home had affected the entire rental market. Everything was too expensive. or the waiting lists were months long, or landlords took one look at his limited income and politely declined his application. On the last day of November, Robert packed his few possessions into a worn duffel bag and left the keys on the kitchen counter. He had nowhere to go and no family to call. His ex-wife had remarried years ago and moved across the country. His grown children, products of a marriage that had collapsed under the weight of his untreated PTSD, had their own lives and problems. Robert had never been good at asking for help anyway, and pride prevented him from reaching out to people who had already written him off as a casualty of war and circumstance. The first few nights, he slept in his old car, a battered sedan that consumed more oil than gas. But winter was coming, and the car provided little protection against the dropping temperatures. When the vehicle finally broke down beyond his ability to repair it, Robert found himself truly homeless for the first time in his life. On the local SAC, shelter had a waiting list, and the temporary warming centers only opened when temperatures dropped below freezing. So Robert learned to survive on the streets. He discovered which doorways provided the best protection from wind and rain. He found out which restaurants threw away food that was still edible, and which store managers would call the police if they caught him going through their dumpsters. He learned to make himself invisible during the day, to find quiet places where he could rest without being told to move along. The McDonald's on Maple Street became one of his regular stops. If he could scrape together enough change to buy something small, he could sit inside for hours without being bothered. The staff recognized him but generally left him alone as long as he was quiet and didn't cause any problems. It was warm, it had clean bathrooms, and the chairs were more comfortable than most places he spent his time. This particular morning felt different, though. Robert couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change, though he couldn't say what or why. Perhaps it was the way the sunlight fell across his table, or the unusual quiet in the restaurant, or simply the weight of too many days spent in survival mode. He sipped his cold coffee and watched the world outside the window, people hurrying past with their own concerns and destinations. He thought about Vietnam, as he often did during quiet moments. Not the violence or the fear, but the camaraderie. The way soldiers looked out for each other, shared what little they had, never left anyone behind. That sense of brotherhood had been the one good thing to come out of that terrible war, and Robert missed it more than he could express. In civilian life, everyone seemed to be fighting their own battles alone. The door chimed as new customers entered, and Robert glanced up briefly before returning his attention to his coffee and his coins. He had learned not to make eye contact with other customers, not to draw attention to himself in any way. Invisibility was safer than visibility when you lived on the margins of society. But today, invisibility would prove impossible to maintain. The three teenagers who burst through the McDonald's doors brought with them the energy of youth and the carelessness that often comes with it. Jake Morrison led the group, his confident stride and loud voice immediately drawing attention from other customers. At 17, Jake was used to being the center of attention at Lincoln High School. He played on the varsity basketball team, drove a car his parents had bought him for his birthday, and never worried about where his next meal would come from. Behind, Jake walked Marcus Chen and Tyler Brooks, his closest friends and frequent partners in what they considered harmless pranks. Marcus was the tech-savvy one of the group, always ready with his phone to capture moments they thought were funny enough to share on social media. Tyler was the follower, eager to please and quick to laugh at whatever Jake found amusing. All three boys wore expensive sneakers, carried the latest smartphones, and had backpacks full of textbooks they rarely opened. They had 20 minutes before their next class started, and Jake had suggested grabbing some food during their free period. The McDonald's was close to their school and popular with students who could afford to eat off campus instead of suffering through cafeteria food. As they entered the restaurant, Jake's eyes immediately scanned the room, looking for anyone he knew or anything interesting happening. That was when he spotted Robert in the corner booth. Jake nudged Marcus with his elbow and pointed toward the homeless man with a smirk. "Look at that guy over there," he said, loud enough for his friends to hear but trying to keep his voice low enough that other customers wouldn't notice. "What do you think he's doing in here?" Marcus followed Jake's gaze and saw Robert hunched over his table, staring down at his cold coffee and scattered coins. The older man's worn clothing and obvious poverty made him stand out among the clean, well-dressed customers eating their breakfast. Probably doesn't have anywhere else to go, Marcus replied, already reaching for his phone. This could be funny. Tyler looked uncomfortable for a moment, glancing around at the other customers who were minding their own business and eating their meals in peace. Maybe we should just get our food and leave him alone, he suggested quietly. He's not bothering anyone. But Jake was already walking toward Robert's table, his friends following reluctantly behind him. The teenager had that look in his eyes that meant he was planning something, and both Marcus and Tyler knew from experience that trying to talk Jake out of an idea once he had made up his mind was nearly impossible. They had been friends since middle school, and Jake had always been the leader of their group, the one who came up with plans and convinced others to go along with them. As they approached the corner booth, Robert looked up briefly, his tired eyes meeting Jake's for just a moment before he quickly looked back down at his table. The homeless veteran had learned from months on the street that drawing attention to himself rarely led to anything good. He hoped the teenagers would simply pass by and find somewhere else to sit, but he could feel them stopping near his table. "Excuse me, sir," Jake said in a voice dripping with false politeness. "Are you planning to order some food? Or are you just taking up space in here?" Robert's hands tightened around his coffee cup, but he didn't look up. He had dealt with harassment before, from people who saw his circumstances and decided he was fair game for their amusement or anger. The best strategy was usually to remain quiet and hope they would lose interest and move on to something else. Marcus had his phone out now, holding it at an angle where he could record without being too obvious about it. He had millions of followers on his social media accounts who loved watching videos of unexpected encounters and funny situations. In his teenage mind, this seemed like the perfect content for his feed, something that would get likes and comments and shares. "I think he's deaf," Jake continued, speaking louder now and drawing glances from nearby tables. "Or maybe he just doesn't speak English. Hey buddy, this is America. We speak American here." Tyler shifted nervously, looking around the restaurant to see if anyone was paying attention to what they were doing. A few customers had glanced over at the sound of Jake's raised voice, but most people seemed to be trying to ignore the situation and focus on their own meals. The teenager felt a growing sense of unease about what his friend was doing, but he didn't know how to stop it without causing a scene. Robert finally looked up, his weathered face showing a mixture of resignation and quiet dignity. "I bought coffee," he said softly, his voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the restaurant. "I have every right to sit here." Jake laughed and looked back at his friends as if Robert had said something hilarious. "Oh, he does speak English. What did you buy, Grandpa? That tiny cup of coffee? How long ago was that? Like 3 hours ago?" The harassment was attracting more attention now. Other customers were starting to stare, some with disapproval at the teenager's behavior. Others with the uncomfortable fascination that people sometimes have when witnessing someone else's humiliation. Robert could feel their eyes on him, and the shame burned in his chest almost as much as the anger. Marcus moved closer with his phone, getting a better angle to capture Robert's face. "This is perfect," he whispered to Tyler. "Look how embarrassed he is. This is going to get so many views." "Maybe we should stop," Tyler whispered back. But his voice was lost in Jake's continued taunting. Jake had moved to stand directly in front of Robert's table now, blocking the older man's view of the rest of the restaurant. "So what's your story, old man? Did you spend all your money on drugs, alcohol? Or are you just too lazy to get a job like the rest of us?" The words hit Robert like physical blows. After months of homelessness, he had developed thick skin when it came to the casual cruelty of strangers. But there was something particularly painful about being mocked by someone young enough to be his grandson. These boys had no idea what he had been through, what he had sacrificed, or how quickly their own comfortable lives could be turned upside down by circumstances beyond their control. Robert's military training had taught him discipline and self-control, lessons that had served him well during his years of struggle with PTSD and adjustment to civilian life. He took a deep breath and tried to remain calm, even as his heart pounded with a mixture of fear and frustration. He had learned that reacting with anger only made situations like this worse, and he couldn't afford to be banned from one of the few warm places where he could spend his days. "I'm not causing any trouble," Robert said quietly, his voice steady despite the turmoil he felt inside. "I just want to finish my coffee in peace." Jake turned to his friends with an exaggerated expression of mock concern. "Did you hear that? He wants to finish his coffee in peace, isn't that sweet? Maybe we should leave the poor homeless guy alone so he can enjoy his luxury breakfast." The sarcasm in Jake's voice was thick enough to cut, and Marcus captured every word on his phone video. Tyler looked around nervously, noticing that more and more customers were staring at their table, and not all of the expressions on their faces were friendly. An elderly woman sitting with her granddaughter was frowning deeply at their behavior, and a man in a business suit was shaking his head with obvious disapproval. But Jake was enjoying himself too much to notice the changing mood in the restaurant. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled napkin, tossing it onto Robert's table with theatrical flourish. "Here's a tip for you, Grandpa. Next time you want to hang out somewhere warm, try the library. At least there you're supposed to sit around doing nothing all day." Marcus and Tyler laughed nervously, caught up despite their growing discomfort in their friend's performance. The video was getting better and better, and Marcus could already imagine the comments and reactions it would generate when he posted it online. In their teenage minds, they were just having fun with someone who seemed like an easy target, never considering the real human being sitting in front of them or the pain their words were causing. Robert closed his eyes for a moment, drawing on reserves of patience and dignity that had been tested many times over the past months. When he opened them again, he looked directly at Jake with an expression that was sad rather than angry, disappointed rather than hostile. It was a look that should have made the teenager reconsider his actions, but Jake was too caught up in his performance to notice the depth of hurt in the older man's eyes. The stage was set for an escalation that none of them could have predicted, and the quiet corner of McDonald's was about to become the center of a confrontation that would change everyone involved. Jake Morrison was enjoying himself more than he had in weeks. The homeless man in the corner booth made for perfect entertainment, and the fact that Marcus was recording everything made it even better. Jake could already picture himself showing the video to his friends at school, maybe even posting it on his own social media accounts for everyone to see how clever and funny he could be. "You know what I think?" Jake announced loudly, making sure his voice carried across the restaurant. "I think this guy is just pretending to be poor so people will feel sorry for him. Look at him. He's probably got money hidden somewhere and just comes here to get free handouts from guilty customers." Marcus zoomed in with his phone camera, capturing the expression on Robert's face as the accusation hit home. The older man's jaw tightened slightly, but he continued to stare down at his table, trying to maintain his composure in the face of the increasingly vicious verbal assault. Tyler was feeling more and more uncomfortable with each passing moment. He glanced around the restaurant and noticed that several customers were now openly staring at their table, and their expressions were not friendly. An elderly woman sitting near the window was shaking her head with obvious disgust, while a construction worker at a nearby booth had stopped eating and was watching the scene with growing anger in his eyes. "Maybe we should go," Tyler whispered to his friends. "People are starting to stare, and I think we're making them mad." But Jake was too caught up in his performance to listen to reason. He had an audience now, both in person and online through Marcus's phone, and he was determined to make the most of it. The teenager reached across the table and flicked one of Robert's carefully counted coins, sending it spinning across the surface and onto the floor. "Oops," Jake said with mock innocence. "Looks like you dropped your fortune there, buddy. Better pick that up before someone steals your life savings." Robert watched the quarter roll across the dirty floor and disappear under another table. That 25 cents represented a significant portion of his remaining money, but he couldn't bring himself to crawl around on the floor searching for it while these teenagers watched and laughed. The humiliation was already more than he could bear. Marcus captured every moment on video, pleased with how the confrontation was developing. He had built his social media following by posting funny and sometimes controversial content, and this homeless man was providing perfect material. In his teenage mind, he was just documenting something amusing that was happening naturally, never considering that his camera was encouraging and amplifying the cruelty. I bet he's one of those fake veterans too, Jake continued, warming to his theme. Probably never even served in the military, just wears that old jacket to get sympathy. It's pathetic how some people will lie and cheat to avoid getting a real job. Those words hit Robert harder than any of the previous insults. His service in Vietnam had been the defining experience of his youth, a source of both pride and pain that had shaped every day of his life since. The suggestion that he was lying about his military service struck at the very core of his identity and dignity. For the first time since the harassment began, Robert looked up and made direct eye contact with Jake. His weathered face showed a flash of something that might have been anger, but it was quickly replaced by a deep sadness that spoke of years of disappointment and loss. "I served my country," Robert said quietly, his voice carrying a weight of conviction that should have given Jake pause. "2 tours in Vietnam. I earned the right to wear this jacket." Instead of backing down, Jake leaned closer to the table, his voice becoming even more mocking. "Oh, really? What did you do over there? Sweep floors? Empty trash cans? I bet you never saw any real action. Probably just sat around playing cards and complaining about the food." Marcus angled his phone to get both Jake and Robert in the frame, excited by the way the conversation was developing. This was turning into exactly the kind of content that would go viral on social media, the kind of video that would be shared and reshared across platforms until millions of people had seen it. Robert's hands began to tremble slightly, not from fear but from the effort of controlling the emotions that Jake's words were stirring up. Memories of Vietnam that he had spent decades trying to suppress came flooding back. Images of friends who had died in his arms, sounds of gunfire and explosions that still haunted his dreams, the weight of survivors' guilt that had contributed to the breakdown of his marriage and his struggles with civilian life. "You don't know what you're talking about," Robert said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You have no idea what war is like, what it does to people. You should be grateful. You've never had to find out." Jake laughed and turned to his friends as if Robert had told the funniest joke he had ever heard. "Did you hear that? He's trying to give me life lessons now. This homeless bum thinks he can lecture me about gratitude and sacrifice. That's rich coming from someone who can't even afford a decent meal." The teenager reached out and grabbed Robert's coffee cup, examining it with exaggerated curiosity, before setting it back down with enough force to slosh the cold liquid over the rim and onto the table. Robert instinctively reached for napkins to clean up the spill, his ingrained habits of neatness and order asserting themselves even in this humiliating situation. "Look at him," Jake announced to his growing audience of uncomfortable customers. "He's more worried about cleaning up a little spilled coffee than standing up for himself. No wonder he ended up homeless. Probably too weak to hold down a job or take care of himself." Tyler tugged at Jake's sleeve, his discomfort finally overriding his loyalty to his friend. "Come on, man. This isn't funny anymore. Let's just get our food and go back to school." But Jake shrugged off Tyler's hand and continued his verbal assault. He was energized by the attention he was receiving, both from the other customers in the restaurant and from the camera that Marcus was steadily recording with. In his teenage mind, he was the star of his own show, the clever protagonist who was exposing a fraud and entertaining an audience at the same time. "I think we should test his war stories," Jake announced with a cruel grin. "If he's really a tough military veteran, he should be able to handle a little pressure, right? Let's see what this old soldier is really made of." The teenager began making loud noises that were supposed to sound like explosions and gunfire, clapping his hands together sharply and shouting "boom" repeatedly. Marcus and Tyler looked at each other with growing alarm as they realized that Jake was crossing a line from simple mockery into something much more cruel and potentially dangerous. Robert's reaction was immediate and involuntary. The sudden loud noises triggered a flashback that transported him instantly from the McDonald's booth to a jungle in Vietnam 40 years earlier. His breathing became rapid and shallow, his hands shook uncontrollably, and his eyes took on a distant, haunted look that spoke of memories too terrible to bear. The construction worker, who had been watching the scene with growing anger, stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He was a big man with calloused hands and arms built from years of physical labor, and his face showed a mixture of disgust and fury at what he was witnessing. "That's enough," the construction worker said in a voice that carried clear authority and menace. "You kids need to leave that man alone right now." An elderly woman at another table began gathering her purse and coat, preparing to leave rather than witness any more of the cruel spectacle. Her granddaughter, a girl about the same age as the three teenagers, watched with wide eyes as the situation continued to deteriorate. Marcus was still recording everything, but his excitement was beginning to fade as he realized that the video was capturing something much darker and more disturbing than the simple prank he had originally envisioned. The homeless man's obvious distress and the growing anger of other customers suggested that this situation was spiraling out of control. Jake, however, was still oblivious to the changing mood in the restaurant. He was too caught up in his performance to notice the warning signs, too focused on entertaining his audience to realize that he was no longer the hero of this story, but rapidly becoming the villain. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose the true character of everyone involved and forever change their understanding of respect, dignity, and the hidden stories that every person carries with them. Sarah Martinez had been trying to ignore the commotion at the corner table while she finished her lunch break, but the situation was becoming impossible to overlook. As a social worker for the county, she dealt with homeless individuals every day and had seen firsthand the challenges they faced. What she was witnessing now made her stomach turn with anger and disgust. The 34-year-old woman had been enjoying a rare quiet moment in her hectic schedule when the three teenagers had started their cruel harassment of the homeless veteran. At first, she had hoped that someone else would intervene, or that the boys would quickly lose interest and move on. But as their behavior escalated and became more vicious, Sarah realized that no one else was going to step up and defend the vulnerable man. She watched in horror as the lead teenager made explosive sounds that clearly triggered some kind of traumatic response in the homeless man. The older man's breathing became labored, his hands shook violently, and his eyes took on a distant, haunted expression that Sarah recognized immediately from her work with trauma victims. This was not entertainment. This was psychological torture. Sarah stood up so quickly that her chair scraped loudly against the floor, drawing attention from everyone in the restaurant. Her lunch tray clattered as she moved, but she didn't care about the noise or the stares. All she could focus on was the need to stop what was happening before it went any further. "Excuse me," Sarah said in a voice that carried the authority of someone accustomed to dealing with difficult situations. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Jake looked up at Sarah with surprise and irritation. He had been so focused on his performance that he hadn't noticed the woman approaching until she was standing right next to his table. She was dressed professionally in a dark business suit, her hair pulled back in a neat bun, and her expression showed a level of anger that made Jake instinctively take a step backward. "We're just talking to this guy," Jake replied with forced casualness, trying to maintain his confident demeanor despite the unexpected interruption. "It's none of your business, lady. Why don't you go back to your table and mind your own affairs?" Marcus continued recording with his phone, now capturing Sarah's intervention as part of the unfolding drama. In his teenage mind, this was even better content than the original harassment. A confrontation between adults always made for more engaging social media posts, and he was pleased to be documenting what appeared to be an escalating situation. Sarah's eyes flashed with anger as she looked at the phone pointed in her direction. "Turn that thing off right now," she demanded. "You have no right to record this man without his permission, and what you're doing to him is completely unacceptable." Tyler looked nervously between Sarah and Jake, his discomfort with the situation finally reaching a breaking point. The intervention of an adult authority figure made him realize how far they had crossed the line from harmless fun into genuine cruelty. He tugged at Jake's sleeve again, more insistently this time. "Come on, man," Tyler whispered urgently. "Let's just go. This is getting out of hand." But Jake was not ready to back down, especially not in front of an audience and a camera. His teenage pride and need to maintain his status as the group's leader overrode any common sense or decency he might have possessed. Instead of apologizing or walking away, he doubled down on his aggressive behavior. "Look, lady, I don't know who you think you are, but this is a public place and we can talk to whoever we want," Jake said, his voice becoming louder and more confrontational. This homeless guy is taking up space in a restaurant where paying customers are trying to eat. If he doesn't like being called out on it, maybe he should find somewhere else to hang out. Sarah's professional training had taught her to remain calm in difficult situations, but she was struggling to control her temper in the face of such callous cruelty. She looked at Robert, who was still clearly struggling with the effects of his triggered flashback, and felt a surge of protective anger that threatened to overwhelm her usual composure. This man is a human being who deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, Sarah said, her voice rising despite her efforts to remain professional. He's done nothing wrong, and your behavior is cruel and completely unacceptable. You should be ashamed of yourselves. The confrontation was now drawing attention from everyone in the restaurant. Other customers had stopped eating to watch the unfolding drama, some with expressions of support for Sarah's intervention, others with the uncomfortable fascination that people sometimes have for public conflicts. The restaurant manager, a young woman named Lisa who had been working behind the counter, finally emerged to see what was causing the disturbance. An elderly Chinese woman named Mrs. Chen, who had been sitting with her teenage granddaughter at a nearby table, could no longer remain silent. She had immigrated to America 50 years earlier and had faced her own share of discrimination and hardship. The sight of the homeless veteran being tormented by the teenagers brought back painful memories of times when she had been the target of similar cruelty. Mrs. Chen stood up slowly, her arthritis making movement difficult but her determination clear. She walked over to the corner table where the confrontation was taking place, her granddaughter following closely behind with a worried expression on her young face. "You boys should be ashamed," Mrs. Chen said in heavily accented English, her voice carrying the weight of decades of experience and hard-won wisdom. "This man is old enough to be your grandfather. In my country, we respect our elders. We honor those who have served. You are bringing shame to your families with this behavior." Jake turned his mockery toward Mrs. Chen, his cruelty now expanding, to include anyone who dared to challenge his actions. "Oh, great. Now we have the whole United Nations getting involved. Why don't you mind your own business, Grandma? This doesn't concern you." The teenager's disrespect toward the elderly woman was the final straw for several other customers who had been watching the scene with growing disgust. The construction worker who had spoken up earlier moved closer to the group, his large frame and obvious anger making his intentions clear. A businessman in an expensive suit stood up from his table, shaking his head with disapproval. Even some of the younger customers began to show signs of taking sides against the three teenagers. Marcus was still recording everything, but his excitement was rapidly turning to anxiety as he realized that they were becoming the villains in their own video. What had started as what he thought would be funny content was turning into documentation of their own cruel behavior, and the reaction from other customers made it clear that they were not on the popular side of this confrontation. Robert, meanwhile, was slowly beginning to recover from his flashback. The voices of the people defending him were reaching through the fog of traumatic memory, reminding him that he was not alone in that McDonald's booth, not abandoned in a Vietnamese jungle 40 years in the past. He took deep, shuddering breaths as he tried to ground himself in the present moment. Sarah knelt down beside Robert's table, her anger at the teenagers temporarily set aside in favor of concern for the traumatized veteran. Her professional training kicked in as she recognized the signs of a PTSD episode, and she spoke to him in the calm, reassuring voice she used with her most vulnerable clients. "Sir, you're safe," Sarah said softly. "You're in McDonald's, and these people are here to help you. Take some deep breaths and try to focus on my voice. You're going to be okay." The kindness in Sarah's voice and the growing circle of supportive faces around his table began to penetrate Robert's consciousness. For months he had felt invisible and forgotten, just another homeless person that society preferred to ignore. The realization that complete strangers were willing to stand up for him and defend his dignity was almost overwhelming in its unexpected compassion. Jake looked around the restaurant and finally began to understand that the situation had turned completely against him and his friends. The other customers were looking at them with expressions ranging from disapproval to outright hostility. The video that Marcus was recording was no longer capturing their triumph, but their humiliation. The homeless man they had been tormenting was now surrounded by a protective circle of defenders. The teenager's confidence began to crumble as the reality of what they had done started to sink in. This was not the funny prank he had envisioned. This was not the entertaining content that would make him popular on social media. This was a cruel attack on a vulnerable person, witnessed and condemned by an entire restaurant full of people who now saw him as the aggressor rather than the hero of his own story. The stage was set for the most important moment of the entire confrontation, when the truth about Robert's identity and service would be revealed, forever changing how everyone in that restaurant understood the power of dignity, respect, and the hidden stories that every person carries with them. The McDonald's had fallen into an unusual quiet, the kind of silence that occurs when everyone knows something important is about to happen. Robert Williams sat in his corner booth, surrounded by a growing circle of people who had chosen to stand up for him against the cruel harassment of the three teenagers. The protective presence of these strangers was both overwhelming and deeply moving to a man who had felt invisible and forgotten for so many months. Sarah Martinez remained kneeling beside Robert's table, her professional training guiding her as she helped him recover from his PTSD episode. She could see that he was beginning to stabilize, his breathing becoming more regular and his eyes focusing on the present moment, rather than being lost in traumatic memories from decades past. "Take your time," Sarah said gently. "You're safe, here. No one else is going to hurt you." Mrs. Chen had positioned herself like a protective grandmother between Robert and the teenagers, her small frame somehow commanding despite her advanced age. Her granddaughter stood beside her, watching the scene with wide eyes and learning a powerful lesson about standing up for those who cannot defend themselves. The construction worker, whose name was Bill Thompson, had moved closer to Jake and his friends, his large presence serving as a clear warning that their harassment would not be tolerated any longer. Bill had served in the military himself, though in a different era and conflict, and the sight of a veteran being tormented had stirred his own protective instincts. Jake Morrison found himself increasingly isolated as the mood in the restaurant turned completely against him. Marcus had finally stopped recording, realizing that the video he had captured would not bring them fame but shame. Tyler was backing away from the confrontation, desperately wishing he could undo the last 30 minutes and make different choices. It was in this moment of tense anticipation that Robert Williams slowly stood up from his booth. The transformation was remarkable. Despite his worn clothing and obvious poverty, Robert's military bearing became evident as he rose to his full height. His shoulders straightened, his chin lifted, and something in his posture spoke of inner strength that had survived decades of struggle and hardship. The dignity that the teenagers had tried to strip away from him reasserted itself with quiet power. Robert looked around at the circle of people who had come to his defense, his eyes showing a mixture of gratitude and amazement. For so long he had felt like a burden on society, an unwanted reminder of problems that most people preferred to ignore. The fact that complete strangers had been willing to stand up for him was almost too much to comprehend. "Thank you," Robert said simply, his voice stronger now than it had been during the entire confrontation. "Thank you all for your kindness." Jake started to interrupt, perhaps to make one final cruel comment, but Robert held up his hand in a gesture that somehow commanded immediate silence. There was something in the veteran's demeanor that made even the arrogant teenager pause and listen. "Young man," Robert said, looking directly at Jake with eyes that held no anger, only a deep sadness. "I want you to know that I understand why you did what you did. When you look at me, you see someone who appears to have failed at life, someone who seems weak and defeated, someone who makes you feel uncomfortable because my presence reminds you that any of us can fall on hard times." The restaurant remained completely silent as Robert continued speaking, his words carrying the weight of experience and hard-won wisdom. "You assume that because I'm homeless, I must be lazy or worthless or somehow deserving of my situation. You thought that made me fair game for your entertainment. But you don't know my story, just like I don't know yours." Robert paused, gathering his thoughts and his strength before continuing. The circle of supporters around him remained perfectly still, sensing that they were witnessing something profound and important. "I served 2 tours of duty in Vietnam when I was not much older than you are now," Robert said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I watched friends die in my arms. I carried wounded soldiers to safety under enemy fire. I came home to a country that didn't always welcome its veterans, and I've been fighting battles ever since that you can't even imagine." Marcus, who had been holding his phone throughout the confrontation, raised it again instinctively, but this time not to mock or humiliate. Something in Robert's words and bearing made him want to capture this moment of dignity and truth. "I worked for 30 years after the war," Robert continued. "I raised children, paid taxes, contributed to my community. I struggled with memories and nightmares that made it hard to sleep, hard to hold down jobs, hard to maintain relationships. But I kept trying. I kept fighting." Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes as she listened to Robert's story. In her work as a social worker, she had heard similar accounts from countless veterans who had served their country only to face homelessness, mental health challenges, and societal indifference upon their return to civilian life. 8 months ago, I lost my apartment because I couldn't afford the rent increases, Robert said, his voice remaining steady despite the emotion of recounting his recent struggles. "I ended up on the street through no fault of my own, just like thousands of other veterans across this country. But I never stopped being the man who served his country with honor." Mrs. Chen reached into her purse and pulled out a $20 bill, pressing it into Robert's weathered hand despite his gentle protests. "You take this," she insisted. "You earned it with your service and your dignity." The construction worker, Bill, stepped forward and extended his hand to Robert. "Thank you for your service, sir," he said simply. "I'm sorry for what these kids put you through." Other customers began approaching Robert's table, some offering money, others simply wanting to shake his hand and express their gratitude for his military service. The McDonald's manager, Lisa, appeared with a bag of food and told Robert that his meals would be free whenever he came to the restaurant. Jake, Marcus, and Tyler stood frozen in the middle of this outpouring of support and respect for the man they had been tormenting just minutes earlier. The video that Marcus had recorded would now show them harassing a decorated veteran, and the shame of that realization was beginning to sink in. "I want you boys to understand something," Robert said, turning his attention back to the 3 teenagers. "I don't hate you for what you did here today. You're young and you made a mistake, but I hope you'll learn from this experience. I hope you'll remember that every person you meet has a story, and that person deserves to be treated with dignity and respect regardless of their current circumstances." Jake's confidence had completely evaporated. The cruel teenager who had entered the McDonald's looking for entertainment had been replaced by a ashamed young man who was beginning to understand the magnitude of what he had done. With shaking hands, he deleted the video from his phone without being asked. "I'm sorry," Jake whispered, the words barely audible but carrying genuine remorse. "I'm really sorry." Robert nodded, accepting the apology with the same grace he had shown throughout the entire ordeal. "Apology accepted," he said simply. "Just remember this moment, and try to do better in the future." Sarah stood up and handed Robert her business card. "I'm a social worker," she explained. "I can help you access services and benefits that you might be entitled to as a veteran. You don't have to face this alone." As the crowd around Robert's table began to disperse, the 3 teenagers quietly left the restaurant, their heads hanging with shame and their understanding of respect and dignity forever changed. They had entered McDonald's as thoughtless bullies and left as young men who had learned one of life's most important lessons about treating others with compassion and recognizing the hidden strength in every human being. Robert Williams sat back, down in his booth, but everything had changed. He was no longer invisible or forgotten. He was surrounded by new friends who had seen past his circumstances to recognize his worth as a human being and a veteran. The kindness of strangers had reminded him that he was not alone in his struggles, and that dignity could never truly be taken away from someone who held on to it with quiet strength. The McDonald's returned to its normal rhythm, but everyone who had witnessed the confrontation left with a deeper understanding of the power of standing up for others and the importance of treating every person with the respect they deserve. It was a lesson that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. A reminder that heroes come in all forms and that sometimes the most powerful moments happen in the most ordinary places.